Thank you for listening to Offline and Unfiltered. We are your hosts, Lakeisha and Megan.
On this podcast, we bring you unfiltered conversations on business and culture through listener stories, expert interviews, and a little bit of shit talking. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to today's episode of Offline and Unfiltered. Very excited to have our guest, Nick Duggan, with us today. Nick, would love to pass it to you to have you introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'm excited to be here and talk with you and Lakeisha today. I am a leadership and career coach based in Santa Barbara with Megan and Lakeisha, and I specialize in helping people-focused leaders do more meaningful work. I'm really passionate about meaningful work and have been studying and working in that area for a long time. For me, that encompasses a lot of different things, everything from purpose and values to spirituality, including whatever you mean by that word. And a lot of my work right now focuses on working with other HR, DEI, L&D leaders, either on their career or growing as leaders. I also do leadership development and career programs inside of companies. And that's really my background. I've worked the last 12 years in the tech industry, companies like AppFolio and GoTo, leading L&D, DEI, employee communications teams. So that's a little bit about me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us, Nick. I'm so excited to dive in and just get to know a little bit more about your story. And so I'm curious, what led you to where you are today?
Yeah, I feel like that could probably be a couple hours conversation on its own, but I'll try and share the abbreviated version. You know, when I talk about my career, I always say that from really the beginning, I didn't know what I wanted to do or how to do it. I didn't know where I wanted to go to college. When I got to college, I didn't know what I wanted to major in. When I graduated, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So early on, it was kind of what each step presented itself as it appeared. And for many years, until fairly recently, I used to always say that I never knew what every job I ever had, I didn't even know it existed until I had it. So I started out in event planning, which I didn't know was a job until I was pretty much applying for it. I moved from there into doing some corporate training, which I also didn't realize was an option. I found a book 20 years ago, actually this year, so almost exactly 20 years, I found a book about coaching that really inspired me and also helped me realize that there were training programs for coaches. And so I got trained as a coach, started my own coaching business, loved it, was a great coach, but not a very successful business person. And so learned a lot from that, but went back into the corporate world. Knew I wanted to do something that was similar to coaching, working with people, helping people find their purpose and passion, but also at the time needed a more regular paycheck. And through a series of trial and error, found the employee engagement space. Had a couple opportunities to work on projects around career development at the company I was at the time. And in pursuing that, uncovered the field of internal communications, which is kind of a combination of internal PR and marketing along with employee engagement, which is what I really developed a passion around. From there, I ended up doing a master's degree in organizational psychology, which really enabled me to double down in that space of employee engagement and also looking at how do we create and change organizations to achieve collective purpose. And then that led me to the last 5 years leading learning and development and diversity, equity, and inclusion teams for a company called AppFolio that really helped me kind of expand my ability to have an impact in those spaces. And I've continued to coach on the side since 20 years ago when I realized I wasn't able to quickly turn that into a self-employment gig. And about a year ago, I decided to take another crack at having my own business. And now I focus on, as I was sharing, leadership and career coaching primarily for HR and DEI leaders and others who understand the power of people-focused leadership.
That's great. And I love hearing about your background because I think so many of us and our listeners, we really struggle to understand what our purpose is, what our passion is, and about spirituality. So I love to hear about kind of how those all blend together. And so I want to just kind of dig in a little bit deeper on the meaningful work piece and how that correlates to spirituality in the workplace.
Yeah. It's interesting because so many of these concepts, language matters a lot, right? And yet in these areas, a couple things are true in my experience. One is language never quite gets to the point of what we're talking about, right? These are very personal, very deep topics, and it's very difficult to really capture what we're talking about in language. The second thing is we mean different things, right? What I mean by spirituality may be very different from what you mean by it. Some people may have a really positive connotation with words like spirituality. Others may have a really challenging or tough or resistant association with that word. So it's always challenging to talk about these topics because of those factors. But for me, my definition of spirituality is really whatever is most deeply meaningful to you in that deep core of yourself, what is really showing up and meaningful for yourself and in your connection with the broader world and beyond. So I try to think about spirituality as broadly as I can because I want to include people who may think about it differently, right? Some people find spirituality through a traditional organized religious path. Some find it through an eclectic mix of different practices. Some may identify as agnostic or atheist and not have a religious practice, but we all care about things, right? Even if we don't identify as spiritual or religious, we have values. We care about our families. We care about our communities. We are passionate about things. We feel emotions. We feel joy. We feel a sense of awe. So when I'm talking about spirituality, I'm talking about all of those things. And to me, it's connected with meaning in a really intrinsic way, right? Spirituality, in my mind, is the search for, the experience of, the quest for meaning. All those things are really tied together. And so when we talk about meaningful work, that's an easier concept for most people to grasp and not feel is necessarily, controversial. People all want a sense of meaning and purpose in their work. And to me, that inherently means there's a spiritual component to it, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be bringing religion or any particular religious or spiritual practices into the workplace, but having that lens to think about what is the deeper meaning and purpose of work collectively, individually, societally. So those are kind of some of the thoughts that come to mind initially in thinking about that.
I love your definition. And I will be honest with the listeners here that when we did our initial kickoff call for this episode, I was like, I'm so excited for this episode because it makes me so deeply uncomfortable. Because I think especially, kind of growing up, as a millennial, and I think a lot of us that are like millennial and older, there was always this like mindset of like, two things you never talk about at work are religion and politics. And so to say even the word spirituality, to me, that reads very like, oh, that's religion. We don't talk about that. That's a bomb. We don't want to go near that. But then when you frame it in the way you just did about like, well, we all have those feelings of joy and sense of purpose and meaningful work and all of those things, it sounds like a completely different conversation, but it's really not. And I'm excited to dig in a little bit more here because I think this episode, I think there are a lot of people like me, probably in our audience, that are like, I don't know how I feel about that, especially in a work context. But I think it's a super interesting conversation to just keep digging into and pull out like what it really means for the average person.
Yeah. Something you mentioned, Megan, reminded me of a research study I read from Pew Research. They do I don't know if it's annual, but they do a regular survey about religious beliefs in the United States in terms of how people identify, what their practices are. And one of their recent surveys, they've also identified kind of how people identify. So there's a whole trend called the rise of the nuns that people, when not N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S.
Okay,
the rise of the nuns.
I'm like, I haven't
They're
heard
taking over. What it means is that when asked what their religious affiliation is, none is an option, N-O-N-E. And more people are choosing that option, Megan, to your point about millennials, right? In some ways, not wanting to, not personally affiliating with it, but also not necessarily wanting to be one thing as opposed to another. There's a lot of eclecticism and people wanting to follow their own path that they put together. Anyway, this research study, there was a lot of difference in terms of what traditions people identified with, what their practices were, in terms of how often they prayed, how often they went to an organized religious service. But one of the questions that really stuck with me, they asked, how often do you feel a sense, it was their agreement with, I regularly feel a sense of awe and wonder about the universe. And it was really the only question that was reasonably high across all populations, whether they were committed to a particular religious path, whether they were spiritual but not religious, or even whether they identified as atheist or agnostic. And across gender lines, across racial and ethnic lines, a large proportion, not all of them, but a huge proportion of all people care about and have experiences of awe and wonder about the universe. And to me, that really symbolizes this universality of what I'm trying to talk about, right? And because it is something that transcends words, it's almost impossible to put a word on it that doesn't offend somebody or trigger something, right? Because these things are really personal.
Yeah, I think you bring up some very good points because, I think Megan and we were really excited about this discussion because we hold different perspectives to this topic. But I think a key component is we respect one another so we can have these conversations. And so I wonder, we're all seeking or searching for something greater, right? Regardless if you're an atheist, a believer, you believe in the universe, the galaxy, however you want to coin it. I think as human beings, we understand that there's something magical in what we're living in and what we're experiencing. And I think we all have different labels for that. But how in the workplace do you create that element of respect where people can have differing beliefs, but still have an underlying agreement, right? Similar to that question. It was a high yes, right? And so how do you create that space for people?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lakeisha. I think it shows up in the workplace in a few different ways because there are different ways to talk about spirituality in a work context. So I'm oversimplifying here, but I'll give you two examples. One is the field of what's called workplace spirituality. I did research for my master's degree in that. And so there's a body of social science research around how does quote unquote spirituality show up in the workplace. And it really is around these concepts of meaning and purpose and people wanting deeper meaning. So they really kind of have defined workplace spirituality as these things. And in that sense, it's actually not all that different from the things we do as good practitioners of people and culture work, right? We know from the research that meaningfulness is important, that purpose is important to people, that purpose is important at the collective level and at the societal level. Other aspects of workplace spirituality include things like values alignment, right? Being clear about our own individual values, but then also being clear about the organization's values. I think we as people and culture leaders understand that it's important to have values that we can rally people around. And when we add into that clarity around our own values, that increases alignment between individuals and organizations. Another component of workplace spirituality is community, right? Which is a huge aspect of what we look for in employee engagement, employee experience. How do people create connections, right? That sense of connection, that sense of relationship is something that is deeply important to all of us as human beings in different ways. And then this idea of transcendence, right? That's not necessarily the word we would use in the workplace, but the desire to contribute to something greater than ourselves, whether it's to impact the planet or to impact people or to leave something greater for future generations. That idea that we want to have an impact that's greater than ourselves. And more, we're also talking about in workplace spirituality research, they call it inner life, right? The importance of reflection. And, there's been a huge move towards well-being in the last several years, which I think is phenomenal. And part of that movement has been acknowledging that side of it, right? In terms of mindfulness work and meditation and reflection. And there's plenty of research that backs each of those individual components, right? None of it necessarily is about the religious component of spirituality, but it is about all these factors that I think are ultimately part of that sense of what is most deeply meaningful. So to your question, how do we bring this up in the workplace? How does it show up? In some ways, I think it's already part of the work that we do. It's just understanding that is a connection, right? It doesn't necessarily have to show up separately. And I think in some places there's opportunities to expand where we think about it. For example, I think a lot of companies are really comfortable and used to talking about company core values, right? But they are not quite as good about giving opportunities for individuals to think through their individual values. And there are ways to do that that are very non-controversial, right? I mean, I've done plenty of those workshops. I think people just don't often take the opportunity to do it, right? They can be optional. You can have people put it in their own words, share as much or as little as they want to. But there's actually research that shows that managers who are clear on their own values, their engagement and leadership outcomes are just as high, if not higher, as managers who are really clear on organizational values. So there's really a link there in helping people become clear on their own values. Now, the other side is more of the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, which is we all bring our own perspectives, our own backgrounds, our own beliefs into the workplace. And a few different things come into play there. One is there are things around equal employment opportunity, right? So not discriminating against people for their deeply held religious or spiritual views. That's really important to understand, right? And people's freedom to talk or not talk about that. I think taking an inclusion lens there is also about creating spaces where people can talk about what they want to in relationship to who they are and how they show up, right? So I compare it to other communities in the DEI space where we have, it is sensitive. We have ground rules. We have people have conversations about how do we set this up so that it's a positive experience and doesn't devolve into people arguing about perspectives. And so I think from a people bringing identity related issues in terms of this is how I experience and demonstrate my spirituality, it's a different practice, right? Than what I'm talking about more broadly about. I don't think you need necessarily all that structure to talk about what is my sense of purpose and what are my values. But if you're talking about, what is your religious background? What are your spiritual beliefs? I think you do need to have a pretty structured system to be able to talk about that safely. And there are dynamics kind of on either side of that, right? On one hand, people's expression of religious belief is protected by law. And so you can't tell someone not to display materials in their cubicle, right? There's limits. Those of us working in HR have often dealt with these things, right? Where if it becomes active proselytization or where people are, talking about their religion in a way that it starts to impact others in a negative way, there can be a limit. But you really need to protect all the parties there, the expression of it, and then the ability to not have to be confronted by something. So all that to say, this is a really multifaceted area, right? And I don't think any of them can really be taken. It's hard to look at this issue or the idea of spirituality in the workplace and not think about them in these kind of slices because it does show up differently.
Yeah. That's a lot to unpack there. And it's interesting, just thinking about my journey and kind of going back to what Megan mentioned earlier, which is the word taboo. And so I am a Christian and, growing up, I had to kind of find my dance with religion. I remember early on at 16, I said, I'm going to be a Buddhist, and I wouldn't practice that. I said, I'm going to be Catholic. And I did all these things, right? Because I was yearning for something greater. And so I came back to Christianity. And so I was raised by my grandparents. And so I had that stigma of like, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics. And just get to work. And so it started showing up organically, right? Like you mentioned, Nick, based on my values or the things I was okay with and not okay with and the why behind it. And so that slowly gave me a sense of comfort to be able to say, hey, this is what I believe in a way that was respectful and also honored the environment, right? I think as believers, we are often like out trying to convert the world. And that's not realistic, right? You actually offend people. And if any of my listeners are on who are believers, we are held to definitely, share the message, be true to who we are. But there's a tasteful way of doing it, right? And I think that's where it becomes, like you mentioned before, where we have to really appreciate both sides of the spectrum. And so I would urge people to, you can have the conversations and maybe start off with a group of, maybe your colleagues you trust, right? That maybe you go hang out and have happy hours. You can slowly start to share, your beliefs and who you are and your core values, but do it in a way that respects the person you're with and the environment you're in. And I think that's this delicate dance with this meaningful journey, right? Regardless of what the inclusion looks like. And I think oftentimes as believers, we can condemn someone else who has an opposing opinion, but we're not here to judge, right? That's what the Bible says. And I think as humans, sometimes it's difficult because we do have that human element in us, but that's the direction and recommendation I give people who are struggling in showing up as their authentic self, because I think that's what happens too, right? When you come into a workplace and you don't feel safe enough to show up as your authentic self, you're turning something down. You're like, oh no, I don't want to offend Megan. Oh no, I don't want to offend Nick. So I'm not going to be and of course at work, I tell people you can never be 100% your true self. That's a lie. If anyone is out there coaching you to do that, that is a lie. But when you get to a space where you're constraining your core values and you're doing things that do not align with your belief or integrity, that's when it's a problem. And so you have to find a way to respect people, but respect yourself at the same time. And so I think what you were kind of walking us through, is really about the practical application of that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing part of your story, Lakeisha. I always love hearing kind of where people are coming from and their relationship to it. And it also reminds me that no matter which tradition we come through or what we believe, we all experience it differently, right? As with any identity or community, right? Not everyone from a particular identity or who believes a particular thing or who's part of a particular community believes the same thing, right? And there are overlaps and intersectionalities and histories that come up. And it's interesting because in my mind, a lot of the skills and approaches that we need to have healthy conversations around these things in the workplace are things that we need in general, right? To be able to have healthy relationships. A friend of mine who is a professor here at UCSB, Dr. Tanya Israel, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Beyond Your Bubble that I always recommend to people that are talking about this issue of how do I interact with someone that I have fundamental differences in belief with, right? And she talks really eloquently about a few things. If you have to be, number one, you have to be willing to want to know, right? And in many of these deeply held situations, people don't. And that's okay, right? You don't always have to be in a position where you want to understand where someone else is coming from. And I think that's one of the factors in work is that we need to be really sensitive to when is it appropriate and when do people actually want to have these conversations? It goes back to, do we make DEI conversations required or do we make them optional? And some of it depends on what it is, right? But I don't think anybody should be required to talk about their identity and their experience. I don't think that makes for a good conversation. But if you are interested in talking about it, I do think, and sometimes this is as simple as setting ground rules, right? And having good facilitation of those conversations. And that's what I meant earlier by having structure, right? You don't want to just say like, oh, we're committed to religious diversity now, so we encourage everyone to chat about religion at lunch, right? for religion and politics,
I just started
that is
sweating.
probably not what we want to advise, especially as HR when we're often setting the policies on those kinds of things. But right. Tanya talks about the importance of listening to understand, right, rather than listening to respond, and really just coming from a place of curiosity, right? If you really want to understand someone who has a different perspective than you, being able to listen and kind of set aside the ego. And I think what that requires too is a recognition that we can understand where someone is coming from without agreeing with them, right? And I think so much of our culture, what's reinforced in the media, is that we conflate those two, right? If I let this person share what they're saying without coming back, with a rejoinder or a response to say like, no, that's not what it is. we can't just listen to understand. We feel threatened by it, rather than saying like, it's really interesting to hear how you came to your views, and not feel like, understanding where you come from doesn't change how I feel. I had an experience at a previous company with a woman on my team who was a fairly conservative Christian. And from, it's pretty obvious that I'm not from what I talk about. And we had some really interesting conversations, right? And a couple things came up, and she taught me a lot. One of which is that DEI includes everything, right? When we talk about inclusion, it is about creating space for all of those identities, including people from different religious backgrounds, and creating spaces where one person or one group's beliefs, if they have a belief about a different group of people, they are entitled to their beliefs, but we also have to make sure that we're being inclusive in the organizational context. So, I identify as gay, and growing up, I had the experience, unfortunately, of some Christian churches being very anti-gay, and I did not feel safe based on what they were saying. And so I've really had to train myself and remind myself that even though that was hard for me to hear, not every Christian has that perspective. And even if they do, we don't necessarily have to go there, right? But I think it's important for us to understand all of our biases, and be aware of where that's coming up, and then actively work to counteract them, right? And I think that's where religion is so interesting to me, because it's one of the few areas where I have kind of a gut reaction as a queer person of like this, if this person is from a particular religious background, it may not feel safe for me. And not necessarily accepting that assumption and understanding where someone is coming from goes a long way, I think, to helping us understand each other better.
I think one of the challenges when we're thinking about this conversation, especially in a work context, and I love your, kind of the analogy you made to, the rise in wellness and the rise of DEI programs, things like that, is unfortunately a lot of companies don't fucking get those things right. And so the efforts, while well-intended, can also feel quite hollow. And so if you're within an organization that either like doesn't have the resources to really make it a thoughtful conversation, or maybe your team doesn't have the right amount of training, or like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, all the pun intended on the conversation. When you're talking about something so deeply personal about like your values and your beliefs, and then your company tries to encourage you to like express that when maybe they haven't supported you in other spaces, or maybe you feel like they haven't, I think wellness programs are ones that get like a lot of hate because they feel too hand wavy and they don't feel like too authentic. Cause like, yeah, you gave us the meditation app, but you're also, we're working 12-hour days. Right. And so that's where I think why one of the reasons this conversation makes me so comfortable is because I know that there are a lot of organizations out there that either don't like look the other way on DEI. They're like, we're going to pretend it doesn't exist and we're just going to hope everything's going really well because we don't want to fuck it up. Or they make a good faith effort and then they stumble, they bumble, they don't do it right. And then they're suddenly scared to do anything. And so I guess through that lens, Nick, I would love to hear your perspective on like, how organizations can think about introducing a topic like this when maybe they haven't done it right in the past, or haven't done it to the level that their employees expected them to do it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Honestly, I'm not sure they should. I don't think workplace spirituality is something that every company should go out and say, oh, I heard this great podcast, we're going to start talking about this, right?
Listeners, are you hearing that? Say that one more time, Nick.
I don't think you necessarily should. And I don't think it's necessarily, with a lot of these things, I think, and again, it goes back to what is workplace spirituality. In some ways, it's stuff that's already happening. You don't need to start it because you're already doing it, right? There's also the fact that it operates on multiple levels. It can be a very individual thing, right? And so some folks that are listening, what you're getting out of this conversation may be thinking about, who are you as a spiritual person? What are your thoughts? And how does that relate to your work? It may have nothing to do with the organization, right? It may be about realizing that you haven't taken the time, or you haven't given yourself the opportunity to think about some of those deeper questions about, what do I believe, and how does work fit into my belief systems, and what are my values? One of the things that always surprises me, I'll do workshops and, on career or personal impact or something like that. And one of the things that I really like to do, that's part of my commitment around this whole space, but also about who I am and how I want to be in the world, is weaving these questions into everything else, right? So in a career workshop, I will do a quick little kind of meditation on the question of like, what is most meaningful to you, right? And through a short process, have people kind of identify a single word that capsulizes what's important to them. And every time I do it, someone comes up to me afterwards and says, it was so powerful to think about that. I haven't thought about what is really meaningful to me in such a long time. We just don't ask the question, right? I didn't say the word spirituality. I certainly didn't talk about religion, but giving people that space to consider what's meaningful to them, to me, I'm not going to say it in the session, to me, that's a spiritual practice, right? That's part of my spirituality and creating that in the world. And I don't ever have to say that word. And if that person has a chance to think about, wow, community or connection is really important to me, and they go to their job and make small changes in their day-to-day that lets them live more of that purpose of building connections, that's what I'm talking about, right? And so to your question, Megan, I think it depends, right? Other folks may be listening kind of with more of the lens of folks in our line of work of being an HR professional or a department leader who are wanting to think organizationally, right? And at that level, I think you have to start where the organization is, as with everything, right? Mm-hmm. You don't want to come in with, same with DEI stuff, right? You have to kind of start where people are. If they don't understand the terms, if they've never had a conversation about equity, you don't jump right in to the deep end of like, let's solve, all these huge problems. You talk about, what has your experience been? And from a training perspective, we often try to get people to personalize it, right? We'll sometimes take examples of challenges or inequities with one particular social group and pair it with others. I remember in college, we often did activities that were based on being left-handed, right? Because the percentage of people who are left-handed is roughly similar to the percentage of people who identify as gay or lesbian. And so we would do things that people could identify with without some of the mental blockers, and say, imagine going through life and, every time you walk in a room, it's not designed for you or it feels uncomfortable. And they were talking about being left-handed, but then think about what if instead of left-handed, it was being gay, right? And so there were these opportunities to put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? And I do some exercises that are really around just fun ways to share more about yourself, but offers the opportunity to talk about identity, right? So I do an exercise, and this is the one I do. Plenty of people have different activities that are similar to this. I do one called Treasure Box, where I ask people in advance to prepare, find 3 to 5 items around their house that represent in a meaningful way aspects of their history, heritage, or identity, and then find a little box to bring it in. And then we do a sharing thing. And so people will share, and it's interesting to see what people choose, right? I give them a whole list of options, and it includes, kind of the social identities, religion, but also family background, historical experiences, and seeing what people choose. In some ways, it's just an extended icebreaker, right? You could do it and not ever talk about identity or diversity, but by the nature of it, you get to learn about people and what they choose to reveal about themselves. And so I have a little rainbow pride necklace that I use because being gay is a big part of who I am and my story, and I want to share that. I have a little crystal that sort of represents that spirituality is important to me. I usually bring my antidepressant prescription bottle because mental health and mental illness has had an impact on my family, and I think it's important to be upfront about that. And then I have like a Star Trek pin because I like some of it is, it's a mix of stuff that's really deep and stuff that's like, I like Star Trek. And it's always fascinating to see what other people bring. One person brought a Bible, right? It talked about how Christianity was really important to them. Another brought a photo of her brother who had died when she was younger. One person, one time, I forgot to give them enough advance notice and they were traveling from somewhere else. So they brought like Post-its, like they had to do their poor, like whatever could represent their history and heritage from whatever happened to be in the supply closet. So all that to say, again, these are all kind of different variations on the theme of you have to do what's right for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways to do it in a way that introduces it so that wherever the organization is, you can still bring value, right? I think, and there are some people that may want to try and push the envelope. It depends on where you're at, and what the organization is like and what you're comfortable with. But I definitely don't think anybody should say like, we're going to, start a crusade, pardon the pun, of like getting spirituality into the workplace.
Yeah. I do want to just go back a little bit, Nick. The one thing I want to just kind of say and acknowledge, I heard you mention like your journey with Christianity and not feeling safe. And I want to apologize for that, because I can only imagine, like going to a temple or a church, whatever people want to coin it, for this ability to connect or feel something deeper and feeling unsafe. And so that just kind of tugged at my heart a little bit, being that I'm a Christian, and just thinking about what it really means to be a Christian, and God calls us to love everyone. And so I just want to acknowledge that and not breeze by that, because I think that goes back to your statement about having conversations to understand, not necessarily agree. And if we can hold a space for that, because what will happen through those conversations more times than not is there are agreements that come through it, right? Because we're more alike than we're not. And so Megan and I, we go through this all the time because we do have different beliefs, but we are so intertwined and so aligned in so many different things. But if we allow a label to create that division between us, it will be, a fight. And it's like, no, I really care for Megan. I love her. I want to know the why or what she's feeling, or, really digest it, versus being so, jaded or so stuck to one thought, because I think that's what makes the world so unique, is being able to discuss those experiences, and then also being able to have a space where someone feels safe enough to say, hey, my last experience was terrible, and that's why, and how can you introduce those discussions? Because I heard you say you have retrained yourself that, when you do hear that label of Christian, not to go back to the unsafe space. So I'm curious for our listeners, because I'm sure there are some out there who've had experiences that haven't really aligned with the spiritual teaching or with Jesus. And, they have some PTSD or some aftermath. And so I'm just curious how you've kind of navigated through that, and been able to come out on the other side who you are.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, Lakeisha, and as you said, not breezing by it. You certainly don't need to apologize. I think if we were apologizing for everything that people with a shared identity have done to each other in the past, we'd have a lot more to get through as a man talking with women, as a white man talking to a black woman. There's plenty we could go into. So I don't think apology is necessarily needed, but I appreciate the acknowledgement, and I will also say, part of it is my journey, right? Part of it is me not assuming things about people, right? And for the most part, what I will say is, just so to your question about how have I come through that for myself, I think some of it is the experience I actually did have, right? I personally was not part of a religion like that growing up. I know a lot of friends who were themselves part of that, and their parents were part of it. And so they had a lot more to unpack in terms of internalized beliefs. For me, I was part of a more kind of spiritual, open experience that I didn't have quite as much to unpack there. But I grew up in an area where people, most people were Christian. I dated a girl in high school who was very conservative. And I remember I went to church with her, and the preachers would talk about, gay people in pretty negative terms. And so I think societally I was exposed to it. And I think that's what sort of, I developed kind of a self-protective, like, okay, if someone says that they're part of this belief community, I need to be aware that they may have, they may not be accepting of me. But I didn't necessarily have to unpack it myself. So I think I say that to say that I knew, even when I was being exposed to those things, that the people that I was there with were caring and kind and generous, right? And so I've always known that it's like the people that, it was frustrating that these people I knew were otherwise kind and generous said these things that I felt were hateful, which of course they didn't know they were talking about me when I was 16 and not out. And so I think, I will admit there was probably a time where I wasn't this accepting, where I was like, oh, those people, have their beliefs and they need to stay over there. I think, through coming to terms with myself, accepting myself, and having a lot of really good role models in terms of being able to listen and understand someone for who and what they are. And everything is a continuum, right? Just because someone is part of a particular belief community doesn't mean they adopt all the beliefs of that community. So I don't know. I don't know that there's a simple answer to the question that you asked in terms of my progress. I think I always, and I'm someone who wants to get along with people. I don't want to be against people. And so I think I probably look for opportunities to understand. And I think because I'm interested in spirituality and religion, I've had to study it, right? And so understand where people are coming from. I don't know. It's a tough one. I don't think a lot about it. I think, I don't know.
I think always pushing yourself, to your point earlier, Nick, like pushing yourself outside your bubble, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to talk to people that you don't have things in common with, that you don't necessarily agree with. I think everybody, we've said it before, we say it a lot, everybody has a story. Everybody is multiple layers of their entire life up until this moment. You don't know what someone's day has been like. You don't know what their history is. You don't know their relationship with whatever topic you don't agree with on. And I just think it's so important to go in with that open mind and also just accept not everybody's going to like you. Mm-hmm. That's just life.
Amen.
And you're not always going to agree with everybody, and not everybody's going to agree with you. Yeah. But it's the pieces that you can find in the middle. And kind of coming back to our broader topic, in a workplace, a lot of times the thing that you share is the work. It's the pride for the company. It's the bridges you make, the community you make. I mean, Lakeisha and I met at work. Again, very different backgrounds. I think we've talked about it at this point, but I have a gigantic tarot card collection. I used to do astrology readings for money when I was young. Like we couldn't be on father sides of the spectrum here. But Lakeisha and I had the same values. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of other things in common. And we also had, we were very similar in kind of how we approached our work and how we thought about the work and thought about the work that we did. And I think that that's what really bonded us. And even as our relationship continued to grow, we share the same values, even if we don't share the same religious beliefs. And I think that that's really what those conversations come down to, is like, what are your values, and surrounding yourself with people who share them.
Well, I think both of you touched on really the same idea, which is that, Lakeisha, the way you put it is we are more alike than we are different, right? And I think creating that space of trust and finding similarity and being willing to talk about it. I think those are the two things, right? Number one, creating a space of trust. And number two, being willing to talk about it, right? Because without one of those, you can talk about it without trust. That just creates more division. That's like everything that we hear in the media, right? The polarization
of volcano erupting.
And you can have trust and not talk about it, right? And I think that's often what we default to in the work setting, is like, I don't want to go there because I'm afraid. But that's true of a lot of DEI related topics, right? We don't talk about race. White folks don't talk about race because it's uncomfortable, right? We don't talk about trans folks because it's uncomfortable. And we have to find, and there are different ways of talking about it in the work context than there are outside of work. I'm not saying it's all the same, but having the courage and the willingness to make mistakes and talking about it is so important. And I think both of you have touched on something, which is that when you can have those conversations, when you create that trust and do talk about it, in my experience, you often find that there are more similarities than there are differences, right? And even just as the two of you were talking, it's like, maybe you're not as polar opposite as you think, right?
Well, just in like the religious context.
Yeah, but even
if we're talking truly religion.
I mean, but even there, I guess I would challenge, I mean, totally out of the work context, right? The more I learn about religion, the more similarities that I find, right? And we all have our own work to do in relationship to religion and the idea of religion and what it means to us and what different denominations mean to us. But some of the stuff that I find the most fascinating is comparative religion research that talks about the similarities, right? And not that all religions are the same. I don't want to be misinterpreted there, because people, rightly have a lot of investment in their path. And there are different teachers and different traditions that are really meaningful. But for example, there is a religious scholar named Karen Armstrong, who's written quite a lot about all different religions, Islam, Christianity. She's a former nun and UN. She was a English Anglican nun who then left the convent and became an academic researching different religions. And she talks, her belief, as she's done all this scholarly research into different religions, is that the core that unites really every religion is compassion, right? And part of the evidence she uses among the major religions, all of them in their scriptures have some form of the golden rule. Don't do to someone else what you wouldn't want them to do unto you, right? It's in Buddhism, it's in Hinduism, it's in Judaism, it's in Islam, it's in Christianity. And then she also talks about one of the interesting things. She wrote a book called The Case for God. And one of the things that really caught my attention was that regardless of your specific religion, people who tend to be fundamentalist in any religious tradition and people who are atheist actually are kind of making the same fundamental mistake, which is taking everything too literally, right? And talks about how spirituality and therefore religion is inherently something that is symbolic and trying to reference something that is beyond our capacity as human beings to express in words, right?
Yeah.
And so when we try and reduce spirituality or religion to words, we're missing something, right? Now, I recognize that can be a touchy subject, especially when people have treasured scriptures that, they rely on the actual words. But to me, that was at least a question to open to, of how can I look beyond the words and understand what is deeper here? And in that deeperness, might there be more unity and connect? Because really, honestly, that's what all religions ultimately teach, is that we are all connected and that we are all one, and that love is what ultimately matters, right? I mean, it's certainly what I understand Jesus to have taught. It's
you got it right.
Yeah. It's, Islam, the word Islam means surrender, and it's surrendering to that higher, deeper presence of love. And Buddhism is about being present to that. The Dalai Lama calls it loving kindness, right? And compassion. Yeah. So I don't know. I have a lot of hope. I mean, not every day. It depends on which day you catch me. And like a lot of our societal issues, it's always going to be challenging, right? I think some of the challenges I have is I get really excited about this and my perspective, and then I go read an article about whatever's happening in the world that day, and it can be really defeating. But for me, and I think this is why I'm passionate about the whole idea of workplace spirituality, is that we're at work all the time, right? And it doesn't need to be a revolution. Like I said, I don't think we need to go whole force there. But if more and more of us are thinking about deeper topics, right? Whether it's spirituality, whether it's how to have conversations about more parts of ourselves, whether it's making a more than a hollow commitment to wellness and inclusion, all those little bits add up, right? And there's going to be steps backward, just as there are steps forward. But to me, all of us have an opportunity to do something, even if it's just bringing who we are. I did my master's on workplace spirituality in 2016, and then I joined a new company in 2018. And I remember a year or two later, I was talking to my coach about how I was really struggling to bring this, even though I'd studied it and I know all the stuff I'm telling you now, I really struggled myself with how to talk about it at work because I didn't feel like it was appropriate, or that if I brought it up in a business meeting, I'd get laughed out or said that it was inappropriate. And it was interesting because one of the big insights I had was that I hadn't brought my own identity as a spiritual person to work. I didn't talk about being spiritual. And here I am like, how do I talk about it in the workplace? Like you haven't even, like you didn't even talk about it yourself and I remember saying it feels like coming out, right? Because I had to come out as gay when I was younger, and now it doesn't bother me. Like people either know or I say it off the cuff. But saying I'm a spiritual person, I care about spirituality is like, oh, it felt like I was saying I'm not serious about business, right? Or I can't think logically, which it clearly is not. But there's that implication of. And so for me, it was interesting because my practice for a couple of months came, how do I bring this in ways that make sense to me? And so it was like, I put a little crystal. I mean, I'm not even that big into crystals, but to me, it was a way of symbolizing, here's a part of me that I want to bring more of into my work. I brought some of my spiritual books and mixed them in with all my leadership books at work. I got a little Buddha statue. So it was, and when we talked about identity, like I said, I brought my little crystal and talked about it as part of who I am. And it was honestly a huge insight for me to realize that for me, the first step was, how do I bring it as myself? Way before I even get into like, as a people and culture leader, what are ways that might be appropriate to, evolve the culture around this? But having that foundation of bringing it as part of who I am, again, in appropriate ways, right? I think I often talk about this work is all about bringing spirituality or bringing meaning to work in ways that are appropriate and inclusive. So I think that's a big part of my process as well.
Yeah.
It's so funny you bring up your little crystal because through this conversation, I had this like aha moment that I think I felt the most safe at a workplace when I decided to bring one of my tarot decks and some of my crystals from my house, and I just popped them on my desk and I didn't even really think about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, some people would be like, are those tarot cards? Can I pull one? I'm like, yeah, you can. And then I kind of like, again, just for fun, but like for icebreakers, I'd bring like an oracle deck and I'd be like, let's all pull a card from the deck. And, and I would always say like, if this makes you uncomfortable, don't worry, this is just for fun, but that was kind of my way of, bringing a little bit of woo into the workplace because at the end of the day, I think it's fun. It's a conversation starter. And, there's part of me now as an HR person in retrospect, I'm panicking because I was like, oh my God, did I make anybody uncomfortable with that? But then the other part, because again, this conversation makes me deeply uncomfortable. But at the same time, I don't know that I ever really associated my love of tarot cards and crystals with like spirituality. I guess it is, but it's kind of something that I was just like, oh, it's just like another part of me, Well, so I think that's really
Can
insightful.
I ask you a question? Mm-hmm. How do you define spirituality? What does it include for you?
Oh, that's such a great question. So a little bit about my personal background is, I was the third of parents that got divorced 6 months after I was born. Wasn't a lot of church going on in my mom's side of the family is Catholic. So my joke with my brother once is like, do you feel a deep sense of shame when you think about religion? Yeah, we grew up Catholic. I say that with a lot of love for Catholic people. Hopefully no one's offended by that. Hopefully you got a good chuckle out of it. But I just never really aligned with religion from a young age. I never went to church. I didn't really know people. I knew people who were religious, but it wasn't really part of my life. I was in a girls' choir for most of my youth. And so we would often practice and perform in churches, and being in them made me uncomfortable because I'm like, I feel like I don't belong here. And then, I am very like liberal. I always joke I'm a bleeding heart liberal. So I think I have my own complicated like feelings and thoughts on religion and just like organized religion. And so it was just like never really part of my life. But when I was 13, my brother's girlfriend gave me my first tarot deck. And I was super into it. And then it kind of yielded into astrology and things like that. And I always associate things like tarot and things like that with meditation. To me, it's my form of meditation. I have ADHD. You can't tell me to just sit and clear my mind and just like sit like that for 15 minutes. There's no way. But I can pull one of my decks, I can pull a couple cards, I can read up on them, I can think about what it means for me and this space and this context and like reflect on that. And so I guess that's probably the closest I have to a spiritual practice. My family on my dad's side too, we have Native American roots. So like the older I've gotten, I've really kind of explored more of that culture and trying to get more connected in that space. Like, you know, I'm not like close enough to that side of the family to really like claim it per se, but I believe in respecting nature. I think the universe is always sending us signals. If like a ladybug lands on my hand, I'll Google it. It's like, what does it mean? So for me, it's like a deeper connection to the universe. So when you pull that Pew article of like, I am in awe, like the universe and what's around me, to me, that's it. It's like, we are so small in the grand scheme of things. We have no idea what's happening around us. So I think it's fun to just kind of explore other ways to feel connected to the universe. And I guess that's how I define it.
I love that.
Yeah. But later in life, I mean, again, forming a relationship with Lakeisha is a great example of, I was probably very similar to you, Nick, where it always just kind of like, I don't know, it's a space I'm comfortable with. I have some bias there or whatever. But I think it's really important. I think it's really important, again, to push yourself outside of your comfort zone. And again, to what we've been talking about, Lakeisha and I have a lot in common. So just because she goes to church on Sunday and I occasionally go see a psychic, like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the grand sense of our friendship.
And you would get a kick, Nick, sometimes like, oh, I went and seen that psychic and let me tell you what they have to say about, about the podcast, So I think it's an opportunity if you take away the element of judgment. It's an opportunity to connect with someone deeper. And so I always have to remind myself, as a believer, that do I want everyone to be a believer and go to heaven? Yes, right? But as a believer, who am I to say, like, you and you and you and what I believe is superior? Like, that's not what it's about, because biblically, that's not what God demonstrated. Back to what you were saying earlier about, the concept of these words being bigger and greater. I mean, the Bible is about parables, right? And it's about these stories that are, illustrations of something bigger that can't even be defined or interpreted. There's one scripture about like, go out and count all the stars. Like, you couldn't count all the stars, right? And so I really charter everyone to say, like, respect your individuality, respect that, respect whatever alignment you're in, like, respect who you are. Never, conform, right? If you're not truly in your heart wanting to do that, but at the same time, respect who you're with, right? And I think that's my guiding principle. And as I shared earlier on, when I was a teenager, I moved to Bakersfield, and I remember we were at the temple. We thought we were Buddhists, we were being all this stuff because we were exploring. And I think that's one thing that's important, for you to know what you truly believe, you have to know what's out there, right? And I'm not telling people, oh, go turn your back on whatever you believe. I'm not saying that. But if your belief stands true, you will open your eyes and say, well, what else? And why don't I believe that? I've gone to Mormon church and, explored all of those things. And so I think the greater meaning, whether it's at work or outside of work, is about respecting one another, right? And showing up and being able to have meaningful conversations, and then also self-regulating yourself, right? If you're in that conversation, and like you said earlier, Nick, which I really loved and want to highlight, is it's more than language. It's not just about words. If you're in a conversation, it starts off well, and then that person starts to move back or clench their arms or squint their, like, stop and acknowledge that, right? And I think sometimes as humans, we are so fixated on the words that are coming out, that we are not observant of the body language or, the tone that starts to change, the affliction. And so I think that is really important, right? I think we are all on this journey called life, all of us, and we all have our stories behind us, and some stories that we'll never share with anyone, right? But like, how can we connect deeper? And like you said, we're at work a lot. So why can't we have honest conversations in that space? And so as we wrap it up, Nick, I want to really just kind of turn it over to you and share what are 3, practical tips you want to provide our listeners, either from a space of they're a leader wanting to have these conversations, or, they're an individual contributor wanting to have these conversations in their workplace in a safe space.
Yeah, thank you. When I think about putting this into practice, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think it happens at different levels, right? I think it always starts with us as individuals, right? Whether or not you're in a situation where you want to, safe to have a conversation, there are things you can do on your own. I think the first one is creating space for reflection, right? I think we've kind of engaged even in a little bit of that actively live here, right? With each other and sparking ideas, but you can do that on your own, right? And I think it can be as simple as asking yourself questions like, what is really meaningful to me? What do I value? What do I believe? Right. And if you are a religious person, that may have a lot of the content, right? If you're not, that's okay. It's paying attention to what shows up for you. To me, it starts with a reflection, and then it's listening to your intuition, right? Because that's really the voice of what I call spirituality is intuitive, right? And when you say what's meaningful to me, what matters to me, like I said, in workshops, people come up to me and say, I just haven't thought about this in so long. So I think that's one thing that anybody can do. And you will have so much wisdom inside of you, right? Listening to that inner voice, helping you clarify what you care about, what's important to you, and what is right for you to do with this, right? Maybe it's talk about it to somebody. Maybe it's keeping it to yourself, right? Maybe it's holding it and reflecting on it for a while until the path maybe it's something completely different, right? Maybe it's something we couldn't even know to tell you what to do. So I think listening to that inner guidance for yourself is really important. I think if you are wanting to have conversations, I think be thoughtful. And I think both of you mentioned it before, do what you need to take care of yourself, right? Remember that, especially in the workplace, other people need to be at choice too, right? And so starting with people you've built a relationship with, maybe you've kind of had something like this come up in conversation randomly before and say, I heard a podcast. I mean, use something as a conversation starter. I heard this great podcast on workplace spirituality, really, made me think, would you ever want to chit chat about it? Right. So I think there's a way to start those conversations if it's something that you're eager to start. Maybe it's starting the conversation with someone you don't work with, right? Maybe it's easier to talk to someone about like, hey, I heard about this concept. What do you think? So I think there are ways to experiment, right? And like you said, if Lakeisha, you were very wise to kind of point out, pay attention to the body language, and if someone's taken aback, maybe that's not the right person to have the conversation with. And then I think the last thing is, if you want to have conversations like this at work, start with what is easy and gentle, right? When I want to talk to a group that has no background of having talked about, this day and age, hopefully nobody has not talked about DEI. But if it's a group that hasn't necessarily had those conversations, or is a newly formed group that they haven't had those conversations with that group, right? Starting with the easy stuff, right? Starting with the stuff that's simple, rather than being like, all right, and now we are all going to state our religious histories and what we believe about the nature of the universe, and what are your beliefs on abortion and the the Palestine situation, and write that all down, and then we'll argue. Like, you do not want to go anywhere near any of that, right? But having an activity where you say, what are some of the things that are really important to defining who you are, right? And setting ground rules around, like, we're gonna We're going to listen to each other. We're going to ask questions for clarification, not to challenge each other. There are ways to kind of, or the question that I've used around what's meaningful to you and having each person share. Those are great ways to get the conversation started, right? And starting the conversation there helps build the trust, right? So once you become a team that can talk about some of those things about, wow, I had no idea that, when I asked what was really important to her in her life, Lakeisha mentioned her religion, right? You don't have to go all the way down that road in the first conversation, or Megan, brought a tarot deck to work, but that starts to build the conversation and breaks the ice, and you can feel it along, right? That group may decide that it wants to have more conversation, and you can get into maybe some of the more tricky topics, or bring in other tools and modalities that help you have maybe more structured conversations for sharing more if you build a trusting environment. So I'm sure I could come up with plenty more, but those are kind of the three things that come to mind in terms of if this is a topic you want to talk about, start with yourself, right? Give yourself space to reflect. And then if you want to have a conversation, start with someone that you trust and kind of practice, pay attention to your comfort level and theirs. And if you want to have it at a more group or organizational level, start with something that's easy to get started with.
Mm.
That's so great. Nick, I feel like we could talk to you all day. I have so many more thoughts and questions, but
we didn't solve all of spirituality and religion in 1 hour.
Yeah, damn. Maybe we can do it again next time. But no, it's such a great conversation. So many great insights. Thank you so much for sharing. Where can people find you if they want to hear more about what you're working on, if they want to work with you or just connect with you?
Yeah, best place to connect is LinkedIn. I'm on there pretty often trying to post things that are on subjects like this, that help people think, that reflect different perspectives, that challenge people, spark conversations. So search for me on LinkedIn and I should show up. It's linkedin.com/in/Nick Duggan, all one word. And if they want to learn more about me and my work, my website is deeperwork.com and talks about my coaching offerings and my leadership programs. And there are ways to get in touch with me and schedule a consultation call on there as well.
Great. Well, Nick, I just want to say thank you for this conversation. And first, just trusting us enough to hold a space to have this type of conversation, because I think it's well needed, and it's now that we need to continue to have these conversations. So thank you for expanding our horizon as well today.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. The views expressed on this show are based on our personal opinions and should not be taken as legal advice. Contact an attorney for that.
Our theme music and sound was produced by Equilibrium. Our artwork and logo was created by Jillian Blanco. We are an independently run podcast. If you like our show, please rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to share your story or expertise, email us at stories@offlineandunfiltered.com. We can't wait to hear from you.